I don't.
So the one that I'm putting in the chat box, um, it has all of the links, and I'll do it several times in the first 5 minutes so that
Okay.
anybody coming in late can get to it.
And I do want to let everyone know ahead of time that we are recording these. I think Tiffany mentioned that you can go back and watch presentations you didn't attend. They'll be posted on the schedule, but I do have to tell everyone before that I am going to be recording. So if you prefer to have your video off because of that, feel free to do that now. And Tiffany, you ready to get started?
Yeah, is that other link okay? Did it get working?
Yeah, Jenny said the other, if you're trying to go to tiered lessons, Jenny said that it's working and there's lots of people in there, so it should be working.
All right.
All right, I'm going to start. Oh, somebody already started recording, so that'll get sent to me. And I'll go ahead and share our slot screen.
Thank you, Daniel. And yes, Michael, that's fine. We'll figure out all the attendance stuff afterwards.
All right, today, if you're joining us for the first time, we're Lindsay and Tiffany. We're both gifted and talented itinerant teachers in kindergarten through 5th grade. We both work at 4 different schools Monday through Thursday, and then on Fridays we work either out of Camp Edwards or out supporting schools with gifted needs identification, service options, things like that. And so today we are talking about using the gifted behavior rating scale as an identity. And we are going to talk about one service option for primary council, which is cluster grouping. If you are already registered on PD Central, we will grab your attendance using a Google extension, so you don't have to worry about that. However, if you are not pre-registered on PD Central, we do need you to sign in on the walk-in sheet so that we can get you your PD credit. Just especially for those that are just joining us, I know those of you that have been here, I've heard this many times, but if you're registered from today, Wednesday, for the 9 to 12 block, you need to attend 2 total sessions to get your 2 hours of PD credit. If you're more than welcome to attend 3 as you please, but just know that you're only getting 2 hours of credit.
Okay, so first thing, I sent out the presentation links again, just in case you need those. And then what I would love for you to do is just sound off in the chat box, tell us your name, school, grade level, just so we can see who all is in our session. Thank you for already doing that.
I do want to say our presentation is geared towards primary talent pool, which is kindergarten through third grade, both the gifted behavior rating scale and cluster grouping can be used beyond third grade. So if you are third grade or above, feel free to stick around if you think this will be helpful to you. We will mainly talk about primary talent pool, but cluster grouping is definitely something you can use beyond third grade as well. So we're going to talk briefly about the gifted behavior rating scale, kind of what it is and how to use it. This is what it looks like. It's a one-page document, very easy for teachers to use. And it focuses on four main, characteristics of giftedness: an exceptional ability to learn, an exceptional application of knowledge, an exceptional creative and productive thinking, and then the exceptional motivation to succeed. In the link that Tiffany sent in the chat several times, you have access to this for your own use. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how to use it. So just some best practices when using this rating scale. I assume most of us have used rating scales as teachers for different reasons: gifted, getting kids referred for IEPs, so on. We do want to make sure that we have observed students for a long enough period of time before completing things like this. So we would say at least 6 weeks of observations of students before you would use this grading scale with students, so you that really have an in-depth knowledge of their abilities and proficiencies. The biggest difference I think this rating scale has compared to others is that, I'm going to go back a slide. Under each category, there are multiple characteristics that might show up in that category. And so we're not looking at how many of these characteristics they have. Instead, we're looking at how often they have those characteristics. So a student who has an exceptional ability to learn, maybe they learn quickly and easily, and let's say they're an ELL and they acquire language at a rapid pace and they do that consistently. That would give them a 4. Whereas a student that does all of these things, but only some of the time, might just get a 1 or 2. So we're really focused on the frequency of the behavior, not the number or quantity of those behaviors. And then if you joined us the past 2 days, the response lessons give you a lot of opportunities to observe these 4 categories of behavior. So one thing we like to do is use our notes or our observations from response lessons and fill the gifted behavior rating scale out after we've done multiple response lessons with our students, because you want to make sure that you've given your students opportunities to engage with rich tasks where these behaviors would be able to come out. And then typically, the max score on the gifted behavior rating scale is a 16. Typically, we suggest for primary talent pool that scores of 12 and above are considered a qualifying piece of evidence for primary talent pool nomination. So if we're looking at 3 pieces of evidence, the rating scale can be one of those 3. And a score of 12 or above, we kind of automatically think of as a qualifying piece of evidence that we would look further with. Now, that's not to say if they have an 11 or a 10 that we're not going to look further at primary talent pool nominations. So we want to be as inclusive as possible, because this is a way to be more inclusive for those underrepresented populations, especially when paired with those response lessons. So if you have a student who's showing up as a 10 or 11 on the scale, we might look at other ways or other pieces of evidence to see if primary talent pool would be a good fit for them.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and give you some examples, like student examples for each category. I will say that these categories align really well with like the different areas of giftedness when they're in like 4th and 5th grade. Obviously, when you're doing primary talent pool, you're not labeling them as an area. but you have an idea of like what area they are showing their giftedness in. So, like, for example, exceptional ability to learn. This might be a student, an ELL student that was able to read Green Eggs and Ham after only 2 weeks of learning English. Again, 2 weeks of learning the language and they're already reading a book. A child who learns how to play a new game very quickly, especially one with strategy. I would think a lot of the game Quirkle. I don't know if you all know that game, but it's very strategy based, and you have to think of a lot of options. And kids that pick up those types of things quickly have an exceptional ability to learn. Another one is a student who makes connections between learning experiences without formal instruction. So they can take something that you may have taught them before and then connect it to something else. I will say though, just in this PD, if you are unfamiliar with the gifted behavior rating scale, if you want to open that link and look at it while we're talking about the character, these examples, that might help you kind of get familiar with it. But that's just a suggestion. You don't have to do that. All right, the next one is an exceptional application of knowledge. So this is a student that can apply things. So for example, say a student constructs a balanced submarine by using his prior knowledge that if a eagle fly feather loses a feather on one side, he has to lose a feather on the other side to balance out. Or a student illustrates and explains how a river changes over time due to environmental factors. Or a first grade student writing over 20 equations whose sum is 10 using 4 and 5 digit numbers. Exceptional creative or productive thinking. This is where a lot of your creative thinkers fall in. So, like a student writes and performs an original poem, student who draws a picture that can be viewed from 2 different perspectives, and brainstorming original uses for an empty tin can. Like, oh, I'm going to roll things to make them flat, or kill bugs, mix paint, drinking cups, stencil for a circle. And a lot of our creativity screeners use things like that. So it kind of ties in.
And this area really pairs well with many of the response lessons target that creative thinker that doesn't show up on either classroom performance or even tests.
Right. Like if you're thinking about, if you were here yesterday and we talked about the lesson, the invention. So they're coming up with a new idea for how to save sea animals. So those types of things, creative thinking. And then the last category is the exceptional motivation to succeed. So these are those students that can make up, organize, and lead class activities or games, sees an independent study project through to its completion. So these are those students that have that motivation to kind of do things that you haven't even asked them to, or be a leader in certain situations.
And I do think it's important to note with this category that it doesn't necessarily have to be motivation to succeed in school, because we know some of our gifted learners, like, school is really boring to them. And so their motivation might not be to succeed on their schoolwork. So looking for like their passions and do they have that exceptional motivation in other areas. And then it's just kind of our job as teachers to connect those areas where they're motivated to their learning so that they can be successful in academic settings as well.
And just a logistic thing, I've seen several people come in recently. The link that I'm putting in the chat box is a link to all of our links. So if you click on that, it'll take you to anything that you would need to click on, a timesheet, or a walk-in sheet, or our slides, any of those things. Okay, so we're gonna do an activity. In those links, there is a link to a student scenario, Gabe's scenario. So if you click on that, there will be that. And what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you read it, because I know that you can read faster on your own than if I was to sit here and read it out loud to you. And then there are links on the same slide, or in the links that I sent out to you, for the gifted behavior rating scale. Now, you do not have to fill out the gifted behavior rating scale for this student. I would just have it as like a reference so that when you tell us some of the reasons why you might recommend Gabe or not recommend Gabe for primary talent pool, you just kind of have those as a reference. So it might help to have his little briefing up and the gifted behavior rating scale so you can kind of look at it. And then when you get in those 8 minutes, there's also a place where you can share just some of your ideas, like a Jamboard. Why would you or why would you not recommend Gabe for primary talent pool? And I say 8 minutes, but I'll check in after 8 minutes. If you all need a little bit more time, we can give you a little bit more time. So you may click on Gabe and then read his and see, would you recommend him for primary talent pool? All right, our time is up, and since see a lot of people are posting in the Jamboard, we'll just kind of go on and talk a little bit about what we're seeing. So I do see a lot of yeses on our Jamboard. Um, there are people that talk about how he has a strong leadership abilities, and he has inquiry skills and complex reasoning into how things work. I see some people showing that he has using the language from the gifted behavior rating scale, saying that he shows characteristics of application of knowledge. Um, he is a leader, creative, innovative. Absolutely, he scores very high in the category, so they were using the tool. There is, I saw one, I'm trying to see if I see it again, that talked about yes, but he would need some supports um, because, you know, he does have some characteristics that would show that he is a little frustrated or, you know, could use some just some skills in some areas. Then I have some that say that he um, has gaps with his academic skills, even though he displays leadership and creativity. So I think for the most part, you all are getting, you know, Gabe is showing a lot of those characteristics. And with primary talent pool, we want to try to cast the net wide and accept students in that we see potential in and that we can help develop. So if, Gabe is showing all these characteristics and he has our three pieces of data, let's put him in the primary talent pool, help him develop and help him improve some of the things that he's struggling with. And then hopefully he will qualify in an area of giftedness in 4th and 5th grade.
I think you all brought up a couple of important points that you were sharing from the Jamboard that I heard. One, I want to reiterate that we don't want to have attention issues or behavior issues be a reason that we don't nominate somebody for primary talent pool. And then I think the other thing that it made me think about is that students don't have to be gifted in everything to be gifted. And so if he struggles, I know writing was one of his struggle areas. He seems to really have exceptional creative thinking and even some reading, high analytical reading ability or thinking ability. We want to include those students, even if they need supports in certain areas and be gifted in others.
Now, for the second portion of our PD, we're going to talk about a possible service option, which is cluster grouping. This option would be one that you would have to at least do team-based, but hopefully school-wide. And so just think about that as we're going in, that this would be something that you would obviously want to talk to your administration about and show them what the supports or what's the benefits and things like that, and talk on a team or school level about cluster grouping as a service option for your primary talent pool or even your intermediate students. So cluster grouping is the placement of several high achieving, high ability, or gifted students in a regular classroom with other students and a teacher who has received training or who has a desire to differentiate curriculum and instruction for these target students. So again, these would be your gifted students would be in one room, and then your just a high achieving students would be in another room, which we'll talk about later how that would look. Now, the benefits of cluster grouping. There are lots of benefits for students. First, it challenges gifted students by clustering them together in one classroom with like-minded peers. So they are among their own, as some would say. They have people that they feel like they can have conversations with. It allows students in the other classroom to become academic leaders. It lets them rise to the occasion. It reduces the range of student achievement levels in each classroom. So this is definitely a benefit for teachers. You wouldn't have such a high range like your gifted learners with your lowest level learners. It provides full-time placement and services for gifted students. This is a plan that you could actually, record on their when they get to 4th and 5th grade, their GSSP, their service plan, because it is an option for that. Puts an emphasis on meeting the needs of gifted students, and over time, fewer students will be identified as low achievers and more identified as high achievers because they've had that ability to learn, and also you don't have the high range of learners in your room, so you could focus more on those groups.
Karen had a good question about, is cluster grouping something that is all day in teacher rosters, or is it partial day? This is an all day service. So the students would be assigned to a teacher classroom, and that's their teacher's classroom. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a student who's gifted in math but a struggling reader, and your school uses whatever RTI system you use, pull out or push in, that doesn't mean that student couldn't, for reading, go somewhere else to get the supports they need for reading. But it is a full-time service option. So I'm going to go through kind of how to implement cluster grouping at the school level. I'm going to talk about how it looks in person versus virtually. Since we are going to be starting virtually, I did just go through this with one of my elementary schools virtually at the end of last year, so I can kind of tell you what went well and offer some advice of how to do this virtually. It's not ideal, but it did work out. So attached to our slides and the link that Tiffany sent out, you have access to this document that kind of outlines the procedures for developing class lists using cluster grouping. So kind of the start of cluster grouping is to create class lists that allow for better differentiation. And so we're trying to minimize the gap from your lowest to highest students so that it's easier for teachers to group students and differentiate for those students when they don't have to differentiate, 5 or 6 different levels of kids. So the first step is to kind of identify performance levels for each of your students. And we want to, and our kind of the performance levels we're looking at are high achieving, above average achieving, low average, and low achieving. And we want to do this without having like formal test data, so thinking MAP for our district in front of us, so that we're really thinking about our own observations in class performance without that test that one test score kind of, I guess, blinding us to maybe some of the gifts that come out in other ways. Ideally, you want to do this as a grade level PLC. It is a lot easier to do in person, but you can do it virtually. I did it with multiple grade levels at one of my schools. We just met virtually and had those conversations that way. After teachers have identified performance levels, we then will use testing data. In our case for JCS, we use MAP to include students. We don't want to disclude students. So if you had marked a child as high achieving, but their test data on MAP is only 50th percentile, for example, we don't want to move them down an achievement level based on MAP. We just want to move kids up levels based on MAP. So, for example, if you had a student who was scoring 90th percentile and higher in both math and reading, that student should automatically be in the high achieving cluster, even if you had ranked them lower. Any student achieving 90th percentile in one area or 75th to 89th percentile in both would be kind of an above average student. So again, we don't want to use test data to exclude students from the high achieving category. We want to use them to include them. And then I want to backtrack for a minute. When you're thinking about achievement levels, as teachers, we tend to think of grade level standards in terms of grouping kids, like what's high achieving versus low achieving. And in this case, you really want to think about your local norms in terms of your school building. So what does an average student at our school look like, and who is above average and high achieving compared to our typical school population? So that might look different at different schools across our district. Once students are grouped, and I'm going to share some resources that you can use to do this as well. But once students you've kind of created those achievement categories, you start to create class lists. It's really important to do this as a PLC and have teachers included and not just hand it over to admin to place kids, that you can have those important conversations when there might be disagreements about where students should be. So our goal is to reduce the number of achievement groups that each teacher has in their classroom. So if we look at this chart right here, this is if your numbers kind of fall in an ideal bell curve where you have small numbers at the high achieving and low, and then more at above average and low average, and then the majority of your kids fall at average. So in one classroom, we would have the high achieving cluster, and then the other two classrooms would have those above average. This allows those above average kids that are sometimes dominated by our gifted students and never get a chance to shine. It really allows them to start rising as well. All three classrooms would have average students, We would put those low average with our high achieving cluster and then low in the other two classrooms. So as you can see, we've kind of limited the achievement numbers. We don't have students at all 5 levels, so that grouping is easier for teachers. So you group the high achieving students in one classroom. Now this looks different if you have only 2 teachers per grade level versus 5, and depends on your number. So if you have a large number of high achieving students, like 10 or more, you typically will want to break them up into 2 classrooms. A group of above average students go in every other teacher's classroom besides outside of that high achieving group. And then our goal here is for this to work, you have to have a lot of buy-in from teachers, and you don't want the whole stigma of, well, oh, they have all the high kids. And so our goal here is to make sure that all of the classrooms have about the same number of students who achieve at average or above. So if I have the high achieving group of 10, I might not have as many average kids as my other 2 classrooms that have those above average to kind of even out those numbers. And then this cluster grouping still allows you to service your ECE or ELL students based on how much personnel and time constraints you have. The school I did this with at recently, they placed all their low academic ECE in one classroom to help their resource teachers be better serviced, but you can spread them out as well. It's kind of a school-by-school decision. And then, just like when we normally develop class lists, we try to evenly distribute students with behavior concerns among all classrooms. That way, again, we get rid of kind of that stigma of, oh, they have all the high kids, or oh, they have no behavior problems, things like that. Then once you have kind of like a skeleton of your class list, then you can move students around to create equitability in terms of gender, race, behavior issues. If you notice that one class has a large number of behavior issues, you can start switching kids. And just when we move kids from list to list, we want to trade them with somebody at the same achievement level. So if I have a classroom that has an increased number of behavioral concerns and they're an average student, then I might move them and trade them with another average student to kind of create some equity. And then we go back to our slides. And that sheet is available to you as well. So if you are not doing this virtually, we do recommend using feeder cards or student data summary cards. I know a lot of schools already use these for class list development in general, but that just kind of helps you have a holistic view of the child. And in person at a PLC, instead of creating a list, we kind of just sort the cards into those categories visually.
Hey, Lindsay, you have a question.
Oh, sure.
It says, when we look at percentiles, is it map national or within a school?
Preferably within a school. As much as we can use local norms, that's going to be more inclusive to our underrepresented population. So that's a really good question. And then if you are creating student achievement levels virtually, this is kind of what we did at my school. Is we had teachers go in and place their kids just in a spreadsheet. There's kind of a description of what each kind of achievement level looks like. And then another thing to note is there's a place for you to kind of list students that you need to stay separated for whatever reasons, just best placement and best practice for that. So a lot of times we get pushed back on cluster grouping because they think that teachers or admin think they have no control over where kids get placed. And I think that's just a misconception. So we are able to still separate behavior concerns and evenly distribute kids in ways that are equitable, but that are ways for teachers to serve it. And so there's even directions on here, and this link forces you to make a copy, so it's free. Feel free to use that. That's kind of where we start. And then, like I said, this is kind of the layout. If you have a normal bell curve, that's not always the case. But if you have small amounts of high achieving and low, a little bit greater amounts of low average and above average, and then your highest amount of kids fall in the average, and this is kind of how it looks. And if you have 4 classrooms, you might have 2 of this high achieving class, another duplicate of this classroom 1. I worked at a school and cluster group with only 2 classrooms. I will say that becomes a little bit more challenging just because you have to deal a little bit more with the whole pushback of, oh, they have all the high achieving kids. But again, if we're, it's not like, it's not like I have all the high achieving and the above average. And so there's a little bit even distribution.
And if you think about like when you start to like create like groups in your class and like you're doing things like guided reading and math groups and things like that, cluster grouping, it helps that because you have these groups created and you're not trying to pull 8-9 different groups. So it helps that range of learners in your class.
And like the biggest, I think, benefit of cluster grouping for gifted kids is like as teachers, I know we have so many kids that we're trying to move up. And so sometimes those gifted kids get kind of left, especially if there's only, 1, 2, or 3 of those really high achieving kids in our class. We may not meet with them as often or think they're just fine on their own. And so when you have 6 or 7 or more of those in your class, teachers are a lot more likely to differentiate on the high end for them. And it's easier because I don't, like I said, different groups, and I have a good set of, high achieving significant group that I can pull as well. So this is actual data from when I just did this at one of my schools. So I wanted you all to see how it actually plays out. So once I had our teachers sort their kids, I just looked at their numbers. And as you can see, somewhat bell curve like on the low end, we split up what our ECE so that we could place them just in one classroom for ease of servicing. But pretty bell curve like. The only category that was a little high that we had to split was this low average. And so usually all the low average would go into classroom 1, but that was just not feasible to have 14 of them there. And so we split them up. This is kind of just an example of how it plays out. And then here's another example as well. This was for 5th grade. So 14 is a little bit high to all put in one classroom, but since we had a significant number of above average as well, it was able to even out. And as you can see, this is a good example of evening out for all 3 classrooms, average and above. So as you can see, classroom 2 and 3 have a lot more average students than classroom 1, so that they all have about the same number of average and above. We're looking at 16, 17, and 19. And then these are just some other examples of how it could play out. This is if you have 5 classrooms. I know we have some really giant schools in JCPS who may be trying to do this with 5 per grade level. So there's just another example of how this can play out in different ways. Here's an example of students clustered into 2 classrooms. I know we don't have a whole lot of 2 per grade level schools left, but it is possible with 2. I will say it is challenging with 2. And I think the biggest challenge is just breaking down the pushback of, oh, you have all the high achieving kids. So being able to really explain the benefits for all children helps kind of break that up. If you are doing this virtually, here's kind of what we did. And so I kind of, based on our numbers, grade out for each class. Like this classroom won't have any above average, low achieving, or ACE. And so we started placing actual kids' names into here for each class. You can have teachers predetermined or not. We do encourage that whichever classroom is getting high achieving either has, it's great if they have their gifted endorsement, but just someone who is willing to differentiate for those high achieving kids, as well as be willing to go through some professional development, just like you all are, for gifted children.
Stephanie had a question comment. She said, and this is only based on MAP. Is yours, did you all only base it on MAP?
No. So I had my teachers sort kids based on classroom performance first, and place them in achievement categories. And then when we met as a PLC, when we came together as a virtual PLC, then we pulled out MAP. And if they had a kid, let's say they placed a kid in the average category, but on MAP they were 90th percentile in math and 80th in reading, then we would probably bump them up to the above average category. So we did it classroom performance first, have them sort and by achievement level, and then we used MAP to bump any kid up. We just didn't move any kids down based on MAP. So hopefully that explains that. That's a good question. And then this is just some considerations to make cluster grouping work best. Using data summary cards, which I feel like a lot of us are already doing. So that's not an extra step or anything new. It just may, you may just have to alter the summary cards to include like ways to mark their achievement level on them. Including teachers in this process really helps with the buy-in from your staff. We just, this isn't a good process. Cluster grouping is very difficult if admin just tries to do it themselves, but really including teachers will help with the buy-in, help with making sure that class lists end up equitable, and teachers really understand behavior issues, students that need to be separated more so than admin who aren't in their classrooms every day. We recommend creating a letter to send home to parents and caregivers. That is linked in our slides, some sample ones. When I was at Gilmore Lane, I linked what we sent home to our parents. We weren't super specific about it, but just letting parents kind of know that this is how we're deciding class lists. Develop a plan in the beginning for placing new students that come in mid-year or students that are transferring from another school. If they're coming from JCP, from within JCPS, is a little easier because we can call over and kind of get some feedback on where the best placement for the student is. And some schools are willing to do this and some aren't, but maybe being able to place a student in a classroom and being willing to move them, in a week or two if we realize they're high achieving and need to do that high achieving group or whatnot, to make sure that you have a plan in place for that. Make a decision about whether you're going to implement in kindergarten. When I was at Gilmore Lane, we only implemented in 1st through 5th grade because in kindergarten, we don't have any background knowledge on them before they come to us. And so cluster grouping in kindergarten would require you to basically redo class lists in September, October. Socially, emotionally, that can be very difficult for kindergarten with our little babies. And so there are benefits to doing it in kindergarten, but that's just kind of a school by school decision. And then be very specific in who teaches which classrooms. You just want to make sure that your teachers that are teaching that high achieving or gifted cluster are are willing to do so and are willing to get some professional development in that area.
And then Stephanie asked, but this would probably not be realistic to do right now. I know that Lindsay and I both came from schools that did cluster grouping. And I mean, it is a little bit of a process because you do want to, make sure that your teachers understand what it is and what the purpose is and get that buy in and then have the ability to like set it up. So, I mean, for the next year, this coming up year, I mean, it probably wouldn't be something that you'd want to do at this point for next year. I think it would be a conversation this year and a planning, and then you could take it head on next year.
Yeah, I think possibly if we were going back in person, you could probably pull it off for this year. I think because we're starting virtually, like with students already being assigned to classes, would really be difficult. So I think in the spring when you're starting to develop next year's class list is probably ideal. I saw a question about.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah, so Mark said, is there a problem with cluster grouping, like with students becoming aware of the whole in-group, out-group, high group, low group? I find that cluster grouping, you have less of this than if you just had like all the high kids are in one class, like the AP class, for example, because even though there is a high achieving group in say I'm the gifted cluster teacher, I have high achieving, but I also have average and I also have low average. And so because you have multiple levels in there, I don't think anyone sees one classroom as better than the other. And I think as long as you're doing flexible grouping and grouping is normal in your classroom, I think I don't see a whole lot of that stigma that you're talking about as a concern. I think flexible grouping is really important because I might have a child in my high achieving group that is extremely strong in math, but not as strong in reading. And so being not just putting kids in groups just because I labeled them high achieving at the beginning of the year, and knowing that we're still meeting their needs. So being willing to kind of move kids to what they need, not just based on that label.
And coming from a 5th grade classroom, I was a 5th grade teacher for 8 years. Like, I actually thought when we did cluster grouping, it was less than when we had all the levels, because like Lindsay had said, when you have high achievers in the other classes, they start to rise and challenge themselves because they are at the higher end and they don't have to in a group always be quiet to the gifted student that's a leader and things like that. So I actually feel like it was less knowledge that there were different groups within the classroom. And then there's a question.
Jacqueline.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
You can go on.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
I was just gonna say Jacqueline
asked. Oh, so if you only have one or two high achieving, yes. Yes, and I would definitely put them together, especially if you only have two, because gifted kids oftentimes sometimes can be seen as like outsiders because they're so far above or they think a lot differently. So socially, emotionally, it's really important to put those kids together, especially if there's not very many of them, because it gives them a like-minded peer, so they don't feel so kind of isolated. It is a little more difficult. Just because you only have one or two. I think recognizing that you have those students is kind of the most important part, though, so that that teacher who has them is aware and that way they're more likely to differentiate for that student.
And then the question, is it beneficial to have more than one trained and gifted on a team and take turns teaching each year or stick with one teacher? I mean, honestly, it's really however your school would want to set it up, but we would love more people trained and gifted. I mean, you can all get trained and gifted. It would benefit your students. So, I mean, That's up to how you all set it up.
I think if you're having a lot of pushback from teachers on the cluster grouping or even admin, giving teachers the option to go through training so that they could be a cluster grouping teacher helps with that pushback. But it does benefit kids to have somebody that's willing to go through that professional development or things like that. So if you only have one person on a team that's willing to do that, then keeping them as that person is kind of best practice there. We have lots of resources for you all. All of the documents that I use for doing cluster grouping virtually are linked. They force you to make a copy, so feel free to use. If you joined us Monday or Tuesday, or if you missed Monday and Tuesday, you want to check them out. We have our response lessons for identification linked. The gifted education resources, the link to our Google folder for our department has all kinds of resources there. I have linked our sample cluster grouping parent letter. Feel free to use as kind of a template for your own schools. The gifted behavior rating scale is linked to this WKU link. And then as well as, we didn't talk about it today, but we were part of a grant that purpose was to increase identification in underrepresented populations. And as part of that grant, our schools all cluster grouped to service those students. And both Tiffany and I had the cluster group, those high achieving kids in our classrooms because we were the ones trained and gifted. And so that just kind of outlines that project.
And we had a couple questions. How do we officially get trained? There's no real official training. It's just you're willing to, be a part of any of your school's training or training that your school suggests that you go to, and those types of things, or be self-motivated to go find things that would help you be a better teacher to gifted students. Is there a sign-in link? Yes, I just sent that link again that has all the links for our presentation, including the walk-in sign-in sheet. And then just remember, if you have any questions, you need anything, you can email us. We're both on Twitter, and we would love to hear from you guys.
I'm just going to repeat this just so that people get their credit. If you pre-registered on PD Central, we have taken attendance multiple times, got your name, you're good. If you are a walk-in, meaning you are not pre-registered on PD Central, just make sure you sign that walk-in sheet, and that's how your attendance will be credited. I do want to do, somebody asked about official training. So there's not an official training to be a cluster group teacher per se, but if you are interested in getting your gifted endorsement, JCPS has a partnership right now with WKU where you can get it for free. If any of you are interested in that, feel free to shoot Tiffany and I a email, and we will get you connected with people that can give you a little bit more information about that. So we've had a lot of teachers that are finishing it up right now, and they've loved it. And so if that is something you are interested in, please send us an email and we will get you kind of hooked up with that. And if there are no other questions, thank you so much for attending.
And Lindsay and I would be envious of you because we did not get ours through WKU, and we
no.
wish we could have. And then Anthony said I attended 2 morning sessions yesterday.